morning. Thank you very much. This is an ever-changing world, no doubt. 3 months ago, probably 2.5 months ago, I was giving a conference in the United States, and I had to apologize because I went into a meeting, everyone was wearing a mask, and I didn't have one. I had left one. So 3 months ago, I had to apologize for not having a mask. Today I have to apologize for using a mask, you know. In a country like yours, which is, I kind of feel envy because of that, where you've been able to get rid of masks. That hasn't happened in my country yet, although it's not in a serious situation. I'm okay. Some people think that because I have a mask, I have COVID. I don't. I've had 4 vaccines, Pfizer vaccines, and I'm not in a special risk. But I have to apologize because I'm doing something different from what you're doing. So please apologize. Please forgive me for that. The second thing I want to say before talking is that I feel very secure today for 2 main reasons. I see several students, and I've been a university professor for 40 so years. And also I feel secure because I have people who have been close to the United Nations. And why is that? You know, the main victim of wars, and we forget that, is the truth. You know? Wars kind of hide the truth, and the truth is one of the main victims of any war. And students, young students, are especially good people to really feel the truth and not to accept lies. They kind of understand when somebody is being sincere. And the United Nations, in my opinion, is also among its mission, in my opinion, I think it's not written down, but it's to gather the truth, to really understand what's going on. You know, when the Secretary General a few days ago was in Ukraine, one of the important things is that he wanted to see what's going on here, what's the truth, you know, which is the main victim, or one of the main victims of any war. So that's why I feel secure with students, with people that have worked close to the United Nations. And I must say that Colombia is very grateful for the United Nations. United Nations played a very, very central role in all that we have been able to achieve in Colombia, which is not all that we would have wanted, but it's been quite an achievement. I'm going to use a few minutes I have talking about basically, I would say, 5 topics. I'm going to tell you how the experience we had in our program, with the people, with the team I work in Colombia, with mental health before all the peace process was very important. I would like to call that how we understood, thanks that we have been working with people with severe mental illness, mainly people with homeless people diagnosed with schizophrenia. Understanding those minds allowed us to understand a lot of other minds and to work out how to go about the peace process in Colombia. The second thing I'm going to mention is how the word peace is a dangerous word. It's a complicated, let's say, complicated word, peace, which sometimes can become dangerous, and I will try to explain why. I'll tell you a bit about the Colombian so-called peace process. I'll tell you a bit about the Colombian Truth Commission, which is what I'm doing right now. I used to be actively involved in the peace process, but now that's kind of in a different state, but I'm actively involved in the Truth Commission of Colombia. I want to tell you what I'm beginning to learn about, what I'm beginning to learn from IPC, from this institution. I had read about it, but now that it's been a few days here, talking to its principal mainly, but also to a few students I've been able to talk quickly, I've understood how this philosophy of the IPC is so important in peace building. So to talk about the first point, with the group I work in Colombia, we worked for about 22 years with homeless people diagnosed with severe mental illness. And it was really sort of, let's call it, although I'm a psychiatrist, I must say, I have been always very critical about the psychiatric system as such, and we developed a place and a philosophy and an attitude that really kind of allow people to recover from the so-called mental illness, and that's very important. And something very special happened in Colombia, not very well known, and that's that because I had the two hats. Let's say I was in this mental health field, but also in the peace process. We began to pair lots of the people who were recovering in our program from severe mental illness. We began to pair them and have them accompany people who were coming, let's say, down from the mountains after the before and after the peace was signed with the FARC, the biggest guerrilla leftist armed group in Colombia, with which the peace was signed. I also worked very actively with the other group, with the ELN, the National Liberation Army, which we were not able to reach an agreement in those conversations. That's something that we have to achieve in the future. But what I want to emphasize is that the role played, which is something quite unexpected, right? The role played by the group of people who had recovered from mental illness, accompanying people who were kind of reintegrating into society after years and years of war. The war in Colombia has been going on for 50, 55, close to 60 years now. And many things have happened in those times. So this is something important to emphasize, and that's how we kind of develop a concept which is globally useful for us, which is the concept of mutual recovery. The concept that only those people who accompany others in a process in which they are suffering, only if they themselves change and they allow themselves to really move forward and grow in a concept which we call mutual recovery, can the process really be successful. And that's what we're seeing in different levels of the peace process in Colombia. And let me give you an example which is quite far from what I'm saying. Only if the people in Colombia, let's say the people who have enterprises, wealthy people, people who have companies and are able to give employment, only if they change, if they grow, will it be possible to bring peace to Colombia. If you're only expecting people who used to be part of the armed groups to become, change and grow, and other people in the society don't change and don't change their attitude towards the other, we're going to repeat and repeat, which is what's been happening for the past 50 years in Colombia. And it's at this moment it's difficult to say. It's a very risky moment in Colombia because we have signs that the thing could be repeated once more, but we also have signs that this time the peace process with the FARC was quite, let's say, quite strong, and it did make a difference. But it's really still very weak. It's still very easy to go back. It's still not something that we can really say, okay, it's mission done, we made. The second thing I said I wanted to mention to you was this thing about peace. We take for granted that peace is something we should struggle to obtain. But what sort of peace? When you live in a country like Colombia, it's not so obvious that you need peace. And what do you mean by peace? Because in the world, I think it was after September 11, it became close to impossible to have, let's call it, a fair war, right? Every war is kind of unfair, illegal. It's very difficult to find a legal war or a just or a fair war. But the history of humankind has shown that only thanks to certain wars for certain time and a certain kind of a quantity of war has been the only way to really move forward in certain societies. So when I'm here in Denmark, I kind of understand that the word peace means something different than when you're in Colombia. I mean, when you're here and you feel and you think that, and I think that most of the main needs are taken care of. People have what they need basically, and the only thing that we have to do is kind of improve each time more and more. Then you understand how you want peace in the sense that there's no dramatic change, no? And that you're basically in the same situation, only that it's improving. But in Colombia, and countries like Colombia, you really see many situations in which you have to ask yourself if some sort of conflict, and even conflict with certain armed conflict, is needed, no? And you realize that we cannot probably yet get rid of what we call, the legal term, I think, is the right of rebellion, right? And that certain situations give people the right to rebellion, including armed rebellion. So that is something I want to, our moderator told us that you wanted some things to think about, so I'm giving you this, right? And to really think if there's no way that if all wars are unfair and if we really are anti-war in all its sense. It's easy to say that in certain situations, but not so easy in others. So I would be satisfied if just raise a doubt about that and invite people to think that it depends on which country you are. You see, if I look at, when I listen to the people, we talk in the Truth Commission, who belong for 50 years to the FARC, or 40 or 30, and even also to people who were part of the paramilitary, and even people who were in the armed kind of struggle, you understand, it's not easy to tell them, okay, you were absolutely wrong. You must have never used arms. But that's not realistic. They say, well, but in Colombia we had, it's not completely like that, but we have some examples of a state that sometimes has been called the problem, no? And a state that sometimes has used violence unfairly towards the population. And you've heard probably of all these horrible things that we're discovering in the Truth Commission. It's something called the falsos positivos, which means people, absolutely innocent people, innocent teenagers mainly, who were killed by the military, and that's been recognized and acknowledged recently. About 2 weeks ago, very, very brave military people, in my opinion, confessed, they made a confession that they did that. No, but it is only 2 cases. We now know more than 6,000 cases of absolutely innocent people in a sort of a body count, to kind of that were killed without having any involvement, just to show results and kind of demoralize the FARC in the struggle. So when those things happen in a country, when you hear the word, we want peace here, you begin to think, what sort of peace? Under what conditions? Is it really possible, to change this sort of thing without arms? So probably what I round up that point is that I still think that the right of rebellion and the idea of a fair war, we still have to accept that can happen. Sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes it's not a fair war, of course. And you just have to get rid of that. But it's something to think about. In the peace, one of the things you have to ask yourself is, who benefits from peace? The same that you ask yourself who benefits from war, who will benefit from peace, and who needs another thing different from peace. The main deal with the FARC, when we signed that peace in Colombia, was to change the use of arms for the use of political democratic activity. That was kind of the bargain, the deal. You get rid of your arms, and then you come into the political ground and you begin to fight politically. that was kind of the deal. But you know that after the peace was signed, many of those people, I don't know today's number, it grows every day. There's 300, 400 people who signed the peace have been killed. You know? So, I mean, who ex-FARC people. So the agreement was, okay, you leave your arms and you begin to struggle politically in the democracy, and you win an election and you become president or whatever. No? Yes, but those people have been killed. So some of those, a pretty significant number of them, have been killed. So how can you go about that deal if they left their arms, they played cleanly in that sense, and then some of them are killed? So there are very complicated issues rising from that situation in the Colombian process. You know, that's why a big group of ex-FARC who had demobilized are now in arms again, and that's how the cycle could begin again to repeat. There again, no? The United Nations has been active in that. They have condemned all these killings, of course, and they insist that the agreement has to be taken through. But the thing is not so, it's more easy to say than to achieve it. The Truth Commission, two more things I want to say. The Truth Commission is, I hope that the Truth Commission, you know, it's led by a very important guy. I worked next to him, which is the Father Duru. He's a Catholic priest, a Jesuit, and his moral standard has been very important to achieve what has been achieved with the Truth Commission. But, you know, we are all very scared that as soon as this report comes out, which I know the report that's coming out, or at least I know the first drafts of it, on the 28th of June, this is going to be very complicated because of the things that's going to be said. And in Colombia, that's where I ask myself, what do we mean by peace? You know? We know that immediately many of the people who work with the Truth Commission can be in great risk in Colombia, you know, because Colombia is still a very dangerous country in that sense, because the society is not necessarily prepared for the truth. And that's something I also know because of my psychiatric and psychoanalytic training. Let's say that human beings, you can't just take a person and give him truth, you know, a big dose of truth, and hope that the person will tolerate that. You have to prepare people for the truth. Like with a patient, like with a client. When I'm working in my room, I can't just come with the truth and attack him with the truth. It has to be a big process. We're working on the same thing now. You know? How do we prepare Colombian society to really be able to so that chances are that they are able to process the truth in a better way. You know? And we have to give it time for the people. It's a process. No, it's not something you have to you can give to a people and imagine that they're going to take it immediately. So that's another of the challenges we are facing in Colombia. So, okay, fine. That was 3 minutes, and probably I'll make it 2 even. One concept I don't want to go without sharing with you is that we've been able to understand in the Truth Commission the difference between knowing and understanding. One thing is to just know what happened, the fact that happened, the horrible thing that happened. But unless we're able to understand it a bit, to explaining a bit, it's going to be impossible to really achieve non-repetition. You know that many people look at understanding with certain doubts, right? Because people fear that to understand is necessarily to forgive. I remember after I don't remember, I read about it, that after all the Nazi period, many groups, Nazi groups say, don't understand the Holocaust, please, just condemn it. No? And it was looked with suspicion if someone tried to understand what happened in the Holocaust. I don't agree with that. I understand that, no, because of the suffering of the people. But unless we also understand what happens and not only know what happens, it's going to be very difficult to really arrive to non-repetition. And thank you finally to the IPC, and I think I'm going to use what I've been learning here in Colombia, no, and to really put together different people throughout Colombia, sort of the age of the people you have here at this institution. I don't know if it's okay to call it an institution, maybe it's wrong, I don't know. To really kind of follow the philosophy of the founder of IPC, that to put together young people who have been enemies, or the countries have been enemies, or their social groups, to talk together as the best way to probably stop violence and stop war. Thank you very much.
Some people over the past 2 years have said that these face masks prevent us from understanding one another. And in meetings like this, it's another common saying that you can't relate to something that is so far away. And I guess for many of us, Colombia is far away, mentally and geographically. Thank you so much, Alberto Ferguson, for your statement, for your input to bringing your reality so close to ours. Thank you. So we have an hour left. I'm happy to invite the first three to take the floor. I'm certain that there are people wanting, and in fact, this is a very disciplined audience, so one of you have already asked for the floor in the break. So Peter Lyngse,
yes.
You're the first one.
I'm a citizen of Elsinore. We've had a lot of information and knowledge here, but sometimes after all that information, you have to make decisions. And I, as any other citizen of Denmark, have to go to a popular referendum on the exact topics we're discussing today. And I'd like to hear some comments from the panel. We know we have a big war in Ukraine. We know it's going to end somehow, but no matter how it ends, Russia will still exist in Europe. We'll still have the discussion for Danes to say, should we join the European Union's peacekeeping and international structures, or should we not? Where Dan says, well, when the big countries fight, all the small countries have to make the decisions and take part. So I asked Dan for that, and especially also Mogens, what should we think about as Danes when we discuss the future peacekeeping structure of Europe and the European Union's importance in Africa and Middle East in the same fields?
Thank you to the first question raised. Others? Yes, please. Second row there.
My name is Hanne Christensen. I would like to inject a note into the debate here.
Loud, please.
We all know that Russia has vetoed the attempts of the Security Council to condemn its invasion in Ukraine and its attack on civilians. A few days afterwards, the General Assembly got together and passed a resolution that obliges the veto casting power to address the General Assembly and sit for a hearing from the General Assembly, UN member states asking sharp questions on what was the motive for the motives, why did they do it, why attack civilians, and so on and so forth. So this touches on the importance of small member states in the peace process. Now there are divided opinions on whether this General Assembly resolution will actually have an impact. Some say it won't, the veto powers will just continue as usual. But there is doubt, there is hope that the pressure from the General Assembly will push the veto holding power to at least amend a little bit its proposal. This was done by Liechtenstein, one of the smallest UN member states in terms of population and so on. And within a few months, they collected the support of 83 UN member states to pass the resolution. So next time there is a veto situation evolving, keep an eye on what's happening. Hopefully they will diminish the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanne Christensen. A third comment, yes. What would that be? Fifth row? Yeah.
My name is very Danish. I'm Rasmus. My question is, there has been voices talking about reform of the United Nations, including the Security Councils, having a permanent African member, having more members from the Global South as permanent members. How likely do you think these reforms are, or proposed reforms? Because to me it seems like a loop that needs, you need to make the reform in order to have a system that can reform itself. So it seems like an impossible task, but how would such reforms be implemented?
Thank you so much to Peter, to Hanne and Rasmus, bringing up issues such as the Danish referendum on the reservation that this nation has had for, what, close to 30 years in relation to our relationship to the European Union. A question or a comment on how to use the UN General Assembly for democratic efforts, democratizing efforts, and finally the likelihood of UN reforms. Anyone who would like to go first? Mogens, you're welcome.
Yes, exactly those issues I think I have some observations on. The last one first, on Security Council reform. I mean, there's been a very, very long effort to change the composition and regulations on the Security Council. But we have to remember, according to the Charter, it's only possible if 2/3 of the member states, including the permanent 5, accepts the Charter. So, very small steps could happen. I don't think they will include changing the veto power as such, or the number of countries having the veto power, but I think that there will be, along the road, an increase in the numbers of member states in the Security Council, and maybe also the possibility that there could be what you call semi-permanent members, because countries could be re-elected to the Security Council. That at least was what I observed of possibilities in this very long drawn out discussion back in 2015, 2016. On the other issue, pressure from the General Assembly on the Security Council, it has been an ambition all along. Liechtenstein and many other countries have tried to give more authority to the General Assembly because of the blockade of the decisions in the Security Council already back in 2015. That was also a big issue. But knowing that you cannot change the basic rights to veto, this new initiative is very useful, could be very useful, as well as other initiatives haven't been taken in order to say that each and every member state should abstain from voting against, including the permanent 5, making vetoes in the Security Council when it's a question of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. Of course, it's not the solution, because Putin will probably, in the short run, do whatever he wants. But it's very important to put pressure. Third question, which was the first one by Peter, on Denmark in the new security situation in Europe. Of course, we all had to think what should happen after Putin, after the war, after Putin. How are we able to return to the efforts we had around year 2000, a little before, a little after that, of integrating Russia somewhat in a partnership, both the European Union and NATO, and accepting that Ukraine, probably sovereign and undivided, will be in a kind of arrangement with those two parties in between. That's very important, to tell the Russians that there is a way out of this self-decided isolation which is taking place now. But when you ask a specific question of NATO, European Union, defense cooperation, I think the answer is it's not in a competition between NATO and European Union, but more or less a division of labor. Probably much of the security policy of the West in the Middle East will have to be managed by the European Union more than by the United States, hopefully better managed than the direct military interventions we have seen under American leadership. And a lot of other things will be on the European agenda in a combination with NATO, not in competition with NATO. The interesting thing for Denmark right now is that we will most certainly have a NATO including Finland and Sweden over the summer. And that means that all Nordic countries are under the same helmet. We have already a defense cooperation on specific issues inside the European Union, including Norway, which has opted into, in spite of the fact that they are not members. And I think the basic reason for Denmark going away from the opt-out on the 1st of June is that we have finally, within both the European and the North Atlantic structure, a possibility of a Nordic bloc that can make imprints on the security policy, both in Europe and inside NATO. And I say to those who oppose, specifically my friends on the left in Danish politics, what I tried to say also in my initial remarks. Do you think it's better to be forced to coalitions of the willing under American leadership after all we have experienced than to be inside the European Union, where it's natural that we go together with all our Nordic friends in a coordinated way under the European Union? And I see two main reasons for going out of the opt-out blockade. The one is the war in Ukraine, the other is the risk of return of Donald Trump.
Thank you, Mogens. I have El Margrethe and subsequently Dan on my list.
Thank you very much. Well, on the EU, I thought I wouldn't say anything and leave it to the politician, but I totally agree with him. We have a tendency to forget that we might have Donald Trump back,
yes,
or somebody of his liking, and he would not really want to strengthen NATO unless it was a very specific American interest. And I would say, I mean, we are not about, I don't think EU has been putting troops or contingents out yet, we are not there yet, but wouldn't it be nicer to be sitting around the table if such decisions would be taken in the future and be able, because we can say no in that case, and to be part of the decision-making process instead of sitting outside and waiting for them to decide, and especially Finland and Sweden. Finland and Sweden would probably like to participate in those decisions. So we would be outside like Norway is for the broader EU cooperation. That's it. Reform of the UN, again, I agree very much with Mogens. We will not see the Security Council reformed overnight. There is a working group, as you said. It's called the Open-Ended Working Group of Reform of the Security Council. It existed when I came as ambassador to New York in 2001, and we called it jokingly the never-ending working group, because no veto power will give up their veto. But, and Dan will correct me if I'm wrong, I think the veto is used slightly less than it used to be. China used to use the veto in Central America resolutions and so on. There is a little bit, not an agreement, but still an understanding that you only use it if it's your own national interests that are really, really important. And secondly, I would say to you, you talk about representatives from other continents, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. I think everybody agrees on that. And next week, I understand the Indian Prime Minister is coming to Denmark, so I'm sure there will be discussions on it. But don't forget, while we can maybe agree there should be one or two from these three continents and not change the veto power. The problem is that all three continents cannot agree on who it should be. And the case in point, next week, when the Indian Prime Minister comes, do you think India and Pakistan can agree who it should be? And then lastly, the resolution Hannah was talking about was adopted, I understand, I actually have it, not the text, but a report about it, on Tuesday this week. I think it is very important. It's a slow process, we don't know how it will work, but it's a little bit along the same side as what Mogens did when he was president of the General Assembly, when the Security Council were going to elect the new Secretary General. It was the Security Council that elected the Secretary General, but Mogens arranged hearings in the General Assembly where member states could ask questions to the various candidates. That did not happen when Ban Ki-moon was elected, because there we were on the Security Council. It was all the secret things and so on. So it's a process that involves the member states at large to a higher degree, and I see this resolution as a step in that direction. And yes, it's Liechtenstein and it's a small country, but don't forget that the permanent representative of Liechtenstein, he was permanent representative when I came to New York in 2001 and has been there all the time, so he has a lot of experience.
Yeah.
We are moving on to Dan, please.
Yes, thank you. I won't comment about the Denmark and the EU, but I did want to comment on the question of the General Assembly resolution, because I think that the important thing is not what direct impact it has to affect behaviour right now, because it won't, right? But is the moral pressure that can be exercised, and I think that's very important. And I've often been in discussions with people about, oh, something is just a piece of paper. You know, it's not practical, it's just a piece of paper. But wouldn't you rather have the piece of paper around to be able to wave it and say, look, this is what you should be doing, or this is what you agreed to, why aren't you implementing it? And that pressure does have an effect. It has an effect within the bubble in New York, but it has an effect more broadly as well. So I think it's very important. The other thing is just briefly about the veto. I mean, I think in gatherings like this, we always feel pretty bad about the veto because, you know, with the veto, some state, the US, Russia, China, or indeed Britain or France, can stop a good thing from happening. and moreover the veto allows them to veto a change in the system that would take the veto away. Sure. But in my view, it's probably the veto which is a large part of the explanation of why the United Nations have survived for so long and why it will survive now. It's worth remembering how the veto came about, because it was a very specific part of the discussions in the formation of the United Nations that Stalin said the Soviet Union is not joining anything like this, where the imperialists of the world will be ganging up, unless we have a veto. Right? Now, the odd thing is that the USSR didn't use the veto when it came to the UN Security Council resolution about the war in Korea. It left the Security Council chamber, declaring the whole discussion to be illegitimate, leaving the Security Council to be able to vote through a resolution in which then the United Nations was at war with North Korea. But they were never so naive again. The very fact that there is the protection of that status, that prestige, their interests, not just for the Soviet Union, for them all, is why they don't need to walk out, why they don't need to blow it out of the water, as happened with the League of Nations. So I think, oddly, paradoxically, the veto has historically been a good thing, even though it really is hellishly irritating.
Alberto, do you want to come in now, or you reserve your...
Yeah, no,
opportunity?
reserve it, yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. So,
If I may add just
can you switch the
one
microphone?
single remark to what David said.
Namely, even if we didn't have the veto power, it's still obvious that no permanent progress on the basic questions of peace, climate, and economy can happen without the consensus of the US, China, Europe, and at least in military terms, Russia. It will not happen. Even if you dismantle the veto power, it will not happen without a convergence of interest between those major players.
Thank you. I have a question from Gaba at the very back.
Yeah, I have a microphone, Gavin.
Thank you very much for the inputs and all the learning. Really, really good. My question is a follow-up what's been discussed now about, as Dan mentioned, I think about 58 conflicts around the world. And if you look at this conflict, almost each and every one of them involves the big countries. So in one way, one can say they are proxy conflicts. Therefore, maybe we have to try to reform the UN and, of course, make it more democratic and more representative. I think what happened in 1945 should be renovated, should be improved to involve other countries. So I would very much like to hear your comment. Then the issue of understanding for Alberto. Why do we understand less now? Why we have problem of understanding when we have so much knowledge? Thank you very much.
And there was another request, yes?
My name is Paul Elger Rasmussen. I have a question related to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. There are some who argue that this conflict could have been prevented. For example, George Kennan, warned against sort of provoking Russia too much, and others have sort of advanced the same arguments. So I'm coming back to some of the issues, about understanding your opponent, understanding what are the interests of the opponent, in this case Russia. And my question is really, could somehow this terrible conflict have been prevented if one had somehow accommodated, some of the concerns from the Russians? I'm not trying to defend Putin in any way. He's a terrible dictator. But, the question is how much, what should I say, injustice is acceptable in order to prevent real, violent conflict from emerging.
Fine, yes, please. It's going to be difficult for the microphone. Maybe you can speak up.
I want to say thank you, first of all, for everything. I want to focus mostly on Mr. Bergson and on Mr. Slay. How do you feel, because I'm Dutch myself, and our Prime Minister, due to public opinion, starts sending more and more weapons towards the Ukrainian front to support the Ukrainian fighters, which on one hand I'm very positive about, because I believe that we should help those people there, and from a European standpoint, because it is so important that we protect the European ideals in Europe. But on the other hand, I feel really concerned about the fact that we maybe get a free flow of weapons inside our continent, as much as it also maybe happened in Africa, and also happened in Colombia, where we don't know where those weapons are. And I just want to ask you, you people, how do you feel about the fact that we are going to send so many weapons, and where we, in a conflict where we don't know how it ends, and we don't know what happened with the weapons afterwards, and what happens if a chaos will break out there? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So 3 questions. First one, picking up on the discussion about UN reform and the architecture that we are left with back from 1945. Second one, can we learn anything from the Ukrainian crisis and conflict and war in terms of what could have been done in hindsight to prevent this? And thirdly, also related to the conflict in Ukraine, is this leading to a militarization of the wider European space? So this time it was Margrethe and Alberto and Dan and then Mogens.
First, I'm not an expert on these issues. First, I don't agree that, but I haven't, sorry. I haven't seen Dan's list of conflicts, but I would doubt, if you go through them, that all of them are proxy conflicts. Some of them are, but not all of them. That I think is important. I mean, I don't think the crisis in South Sudan is a proxy conflict necessarily. I think maybe the conflict in Mali, the French plays a much bigger role, and so on. So, and I totally agree, we need to reform the UN, but we don't do it by throwing the charter out of the window and starting fresh. We need to do it step by step, like we talked about the selection at the Secretary General and Liechtenstein's resolution and so on. I think that is the way to move, because I'm strongly believing that if the UN didn't exist in the world today, we would have to reinvent it. So don't throw it out with the water. Free flows of weapons. Yes, I hope that those that are providing, especially heavy weapons, are feeling some kinds of responsibility for where they're going. But if you look at the whole world today, you know there's a lot of weapons moving. And again, in South Sudan, it took the security a very long time to adopt a weapons embargo. And when they finally adopted it, they only had the necessary 9 votes for it, and Russia and China and a few other countries abstained. They didn't use veto, Russia and China, but they abstained. And furthermore, South Sudan is a landlocked country. The only neighboring country to South Sudan, who at that time was a member of the Security Council, was Ethiopia. They abstained. So how effective do you think that weapon embargo would be? And the respect for the weapon embargo from the government side was, of course, not very high, because they said, yeah, you got 9 votes, but what about the other 6? So I think in general we have to do better on this trade worldwide of weapons. I'm not seeing it as a specific problem in relation to Russia and Ukraine. On the question of Russia and Ukraine, could it have been prevented? I don't know. but I was at a meeting last week where security and military experts were presenting, and I at least left that meeting with a feeling that we in the West have not, over the last 20 years or maybe more, sufficient intelligence about the capability of the Russian army. I think we have been seeing those medal parades and the big parades in Moscow and think that, because when I heard this expert talk about the loss Russia has had, their problems with producing more tanks and supplying their troops and so on, I think it came as a surprise. And it was interesting when I was driving up here this morning, there was something on the radio about how come that Ukraine is able to react so relatively efficiently against the Russian forces, because otherwise we would have thought when the conflict started that Ukraine would have been taken over very quickly. But there was somebody from a university somewhere in Denmark saying that the United States were providing them with a lot of intelligence operations, so they knew where the movements were. And I think we have been a little naive in relation to Russia in having details about their military capabilities. And also the number of Russian generals and officers that have been lost and so on. It was quite a surprise for me, but I'm not an expert on Russia and Ukraine. Thank you.
Moving on to Alberto Ferguson, please.
Thank you. Just to comment, probably 2 or 3 of the questions in one block. Yes, many wars are happening at the same time, but bear in mind also that this has been the case for many years. I mean, there are many wars that have happened and ended in many areas of the world. So it seems like, to return to one of my points, that wars and armed wars is something that kind of has to happen somehow in the process of development of countries. Only that certain wars, they don't receive so much media attention. When we hear the same thing happens within Colombia and in the world. In Colombia, there are many areas where there are local conflicts and local mini wars. Mini wars, probably the word mini is not right for any war, but I mean, in the media it's mini, no? It's not visible. They are not shown in the media. So this is something we have to bear in mind, how to see the importance of a war, dependence on how much it's in the public, it's in the media. I mean, I was thinking every time I think it's horrible what's happening in Ukraine, no doubt about that. But it's also true that what has happened in Ukraine and what will end up happening in Ukraine has happened, let's say, in Colombia, but nobody knows about that. It happens every month somehow, or every year at least. So there are different kind of standards to where the world gets concerned or not about the wars that are going on. Colombia has 10 million of victims, and probably more than that. This is an understatement of all that has been happening. And the influence of others, this is the last thing I want to comment related, I hope, to the question, is that we've only been able to understand within the Truth Commission how the war in Colombia, but not only in Colombia, in a small town in Colombia, is a consequence. We've been able to show that between the big nations, no? How the big conflicts between, let's say, the Cold War, for example, no? We've been able to understand what was going on between the US and Russia, let's say, the Soviet Union, to call it how it was called, how all that ended up in lots of killings and conflicts and wars in small regions and towns in Colombia. So this connection between what happens with the big countries and the war that's developed as a consequence of that in small countries is something that we bear in mind. In Colombia, we have a saying that what is discussed in Bogota, in the parliament, which is the discussion between parties, ends up in the killings in the territories. No? In the Congress, they discuss it, but any discussion that happens there ends up in killings in small territories. I think something of this also happens in the world. All that we've understood of how the big geographical, conflicts in the world influenced the war in Colombia. Thank you.
Moving on to Dan Smith.
Yes, I wanted to comment on a couple of the questions. One is on the question of the proxy war. I think that it's a much more complicated term than than it seems at first. Ukraine, right? I want to really touch on a sore point and something that could be quite controversial here. Ukraine is a war in its own right. Russia invaded, Ukraine is defending itself, the outside is supporting Ukraine, right? Sending weapons and so on. And I'll come to your point, which is a very important one, in a moment. But at the same time, you can look at this and see, especially as you read the things which are said by Biden or by Liz Truss, the UK Foreign Secretary, or by Boris Johnson, or by one or two of the other politicians in Europe, but which Macron, France, and Scholz of Germany have steered away from, you could see this as being a proxy war. That outsiders have got themselves into a position where they're able to give Russia, a beating, give them a bloody nose, without actually committing any of their own forces to the fighting. Committing equipment, of course, sending equipment, money, resources, but not having to have the problem of the boys come home in coffins or body bags, which is always what makes war in Britain or America unpopular. And this could be seen, if one were being really both skeptical and historical about this, in the light of the US strategy in Afghanistan during the 1980s, where there was a group in the US State Department which called themselves the Bleeders, right? Which in British English is an insult. But it was because what they wanted to do was bleed the Soviet Union by supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And of course, by supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, they supported a force which got stronger, which came to power, which has inflicted chaos on Afghanistan for the 30 years after the USSR withdrew. But the Bleeders probably thought at the time that they were really pretty successful, because they did indeed bleed the USSR. So proxy war is a subtle term, right? And I think that sometimes when one uses it, it's almost like it doesn't give enough credit to the war itself, where there may be people who are fighting for what they see as being social justice, or their rights, or their national rights, or fighting against repression, and they take external support. Of course they do. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are completely and only the instruments of the outside power. Yet the outside power is also instrumentalizing them. So these relationships are actually quite complicated. I just wanted to say that. In terms of NATO and, basically the question about whether or not the war could have been prevented, it can be seen as being a question of, what could NATO have done to behave differently? Is it really true that NATO's expansion is a cause, in some sense, of this war? Now, I was always a critic in the 1990s of the way in which NATO was enlarging. But I want to avoid using the word expansion, which sounds like NATO did it, and rather go for enlargement, because what was actually happening was that the people in the governments in newly democratic countries in Central and Eastern Europe wanted to join the Western Alliance, and they wanted to join it because of their dislike of and fear of Russia. Now, I think that NATO could have handled that situation better. So I have a certain amount of sympathy with Russian friends at the time who saw that as being a threatening process. However, on the other side of it, first of all, there is nothing that defends or justifies that invasion, let alone attacking civilian targets, attacking hospitals and schools, attacking humanitarian convoys, mass graves, apparently torture, systematic use of rape as a weapon of war, the looting and the vandalizing which has been going on, and so on. Nothing can justify that. But in addition, one of the problems is that Russia traditionally has a concept of security that from the outside looks all too much like a concept of power. And this is partly because there's a real investment in the idea of what we call buffer states, buffer zones. And Ukraine was to be a buffer zone. And it was because Ukraine was, of course, I mean, it's a buffer zone, yes, but it's a place where real people live, and they have aspirations, and they get things right, and they get things wrong, and there's some corruption, and there's some good government, and there's some bad government. Of course, it's a real place, and it wants to lean towards Western Europe. And that would take it out of the buffer role for Russia. So at that point, that becomes, in Russia's perception, or in Putin's perception, a threat. I do think that it is genuinely seen as a threat. But the way in which to sort that out is to project power and do something as awful as what's happening now. So ultimately, in the end, in terms of Russian political psychology, could this have been prevented? I'm not sure. I think things could have been done differently. I definitely think it was a mistake to offer NATO membership as a prospect to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. But would that in the end have made a difference, given that Ukraine public opinion wanted to lean towards Western Europe? Sometimes I think that the real problem that some countries face is the neighbourhood they live in. For example, Lebanon faces two big problems in its life. One is its ethnic division and the politicization of its ethnic division, and the other thing is that it happens to live next door to Syria and Israel. And if one could, one maybe as a Lebanese would choose a different neighbourhood.
And finally, Mogens Lykketoft for a brief response.
Yeah, it can be rather brief because my arguments are in family with those of Dan just mentioned. To be more exact on what I think was the most wrong decision taken by NATO was the 2008 decision of giving Ukraine some expectations on NATO's membership because George W. Bush had it among the number of failures he had in his political judgment, and in spite of the fact that Germany and France would never have accepted the idea anyway. So you could say that kind of decision can easily explain some of what happens afterwards. I mean, on the other hand, if you agreed in NATO to bring Ukraine inside NATO, you should have done it exactly at that time, not a minute later. Well, that was one thing. The other thing was about the UN reform. A lot could be said about specific small steps, and we have tried to do some of them. I think it's important to say, also after my experience, the 1 year I was President of the General Assembly, what went in the right direction, particularly the Paris Climate Agreement, was because it was the moment within the last 10 years where you had the strongest consensus between the United States and China. Any reform of the UN will have to be built on the understanding that China will have a bigger role in the international structure. Because we want to include them. And I think also they want to be included, but not on our Western terms only. And we know, well, we have the conflict in Ukraine, it's terrible, it could be more terrible, but we also know that when it comes to peace, economy and climate in the 21st century, the most important thing is that China and the US realize they have more common interests than opposing interests. And that's a huge task for Europe to try to bring forward, because it's moving in the wrong direction on both places. There's too much continuation of Trump policy in the US handling of China, and there's a lot wrong with China. But anyway, the conclusion is clear. If we don't manage to do that competition between those two in a peaceful way, we're out. We're out. and the UN has to be, the reform efforts in the UN has to be built on that understanding of things. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm now on my watch left with about 10, 12, maybe 15 minutes. I see a hand from Björn. I have a question myself, and then I'm going to close because I'll give the chance to the panel to wind up their interventions this morning. Björn first.
Thank you, Björn Förde.
Björn, would you like this?
Okay.
Thank you. Obviously, we need an international peace-building system. I'm just wondering, listening to the perspectives you're giving on the overall system, if we should not also focus a little bit on the community-based level. I'm not talking about Ukraine here, I'm talking about probably more about Colombia and similar situations, where we know that there are lots, at least many, community-based peace builders. And I'm just wondering how you see them fitting into this reform thinking of the international system, because I think they're being underutilized. Maybe they don't have the right fit into the international system, which may be crowding them out. Maybe they don't always have the right resources. I know it's a small corner of it, but maybe for some of the many conflicts that Dan is mentioning, it might be relevant to discuss it a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Björn, and that actually links well up to what my question focuses on. Just to draw a little bit on this framework, we are here at IPC, a 100-year-old institution which has, over the years, had continuous involvement with civil society. Civil society in our home country, Denmark, but also civil society movements across the world. Now, as an institution, we have constantly been confronted, could we issue declarations? Should we send letters in the names of IPC students at a certain cohort, of IPC staff, of the IPC Council? Should we act, or should we mainly see ourselves as a venue of people from civil society using the facilities, the space here? Now, intrigued by the presentations and the discussions which so far have, as Björn also hinted, has focused by and large on sort of the movements, the positions of major powers. Dan called for greater attention being paid to the middle powers. I would like if the panelists could give a concrete, specific example of civil society making a decisive role in a peace process. And I mind you, not necessarily a positive role, but an example from the real world where a civil society effort has influenced the direction of a peace process. That would be interesting, and I think hope to a large extent in line also with Björn's comment. So I'll hand back to you. I'll suggest we start with Mogens and move to my right. Mogens, Elmargrethe, Dan and Alberto. So as to conclude this very fascinating, very intense morning session. Mogens, you're first.
First of all, civil society, both at the local, national level and internationally, is very, very necessary in order to improve also the international organizations, foremost the United Nations. I think the example I have seen is that when we got the ambitious global goals in 2015, it would never have happened with only the governments involved in the process. The ambitions of the Sustainable Development Goals were made out of the very strong impact from civil society on the process. There are in the UN systems a lot of opposition against involving civil society anymore, especially from those member states who haven't got such a thing as a civil society. But anyway, also in the process of electing the Secretary General, which you mentioned, we actually managed to involve civil society in the discussion much more. And I think every progress depends on that process being brought further. Not to answer that civil society cannot be the other way around. I mean, I nearly don't dare to say civil society in Rwanda, 1994, was a terrible factor in the genocide. So it's not all kinds of civil society movements we're interested in, but those who have been engaged in the UN system should be engaged even more, and we should help them being heard there. Okay.
Marie?
Well, I think when I talked about the UN
Microphone,
peacekeeping.
please.
Oh, sorry. I'm not good at this. I was talking about a peacekeeping mission, keeping the peace while the peace was being built. Part of building the peace is to make sure that the peace is not only something that the politicians have decided in the capital, but that it is owned by the population. So I think it's very important that while you are building the peace, you do, and UN missions both in Liberia and South Sudan, we did a lot out in local communities to get the local people together and discuss what the peace agreement meant and for them and so on to create ownership. So I totally agree, but I also want to say, as Mogens was alerting to, we have to engage with the right local communities. It was, I was struck when I was in Addis Ababa, and the first peace agreement after the conflict in 13, that was the one, the first one was from 15, was signed. There were so-called local communities and women's group and so on, but that was local communities who had forced their way to Addis. They did not represent the local community and the women in the society. They lived in Nairobi. There was even one of them who, in the follow-up, asked me if we couldn't do something, the UN, for the Sudanese diplomats abroad who didn't have money to put their kids to school. And I was looking at her and said, you know, look how they're suffering. So it has to be the right local communities you engage with. And then to your question, are there concrete examples? Yes. I don't know if you can remember, before the peace agreement in Liberia in 2003 was signed in Accra, President Charles Taylor was not too happy with it, and he was about to leave the country and so on. And there was, and one of them actually got the Nobel Peace Prize. There was a huge group of Liberian women who had had enough, and they dressed up in white and stopped him on the way to the airport where he was leaving and forcing him. So there are local groups who have played a role. And I happen to know that at the final discussions in Accra on the peace agreement that the parties in Liberia to the Liberian conflict eventually signed, at a certain point Charles Taylor was about to leave the room, but the leader of the negotiations from ECOWAS was the former Nigerian president. He managed to get the women's group who were outside of the room to block the doors so he couldn't get out. So no, I'm saying it jokingly, but there are examples that we can laugh about, but where the local have taken an interest and engaging themselves, because we have to make sure that the peace is not just for the presidents and the next president, or for them to be continue on corruption and so on and so forth, and for them to ask for services from the government, because don't forget, in many, at least African countries, many of the conflicts are based on the fact that the government is not taking care of them. We talk about the jihadists moving from the north of Mali to central Mali, but sorry, if the government in Bamako is not providing schools, education services to central Mali, then it doesn't matter when the jihadists comes and they make a Muslim school. One Muslim school is better than no school. So you have to work with the local communities to get that ownership to peace. Otherwise, you're not successful.
Thank you
It's
so
not sustainable.
Thank you so much. I can invite those in the audience who are interested in the Liberia case to watch a very interesting documentary made exactly of the women's group that influenced the peace process. I've forgotten the name, but I'll come.
Back to health.
Bring the devil back.
Pray the devil back
pray
to
the
health.
devil
Right.
back to health. Yeah, good. Thank you for that. Dan, we're moving on to you. I may put on your shoulders important issues that has been overlooked to some extent, as far as I recall from my notes. The question of the militarization risk in Europe because of the inflow of weapons to Ukraine currently.
Yes, and that was the first thing I was going to comment on, because I realised that in my previous answer I said I would, and then I'm old, so you have to forgive me. I just passed on. Experience says that if you throw a lot of weapons at a conflict, then as that conflict dies down, many of those weapons will still be around, they will still be functional, and they will often get sold. I had a friend of mine, in order to make a point, he was Pakistani, I say was because he's long since passed away, but he went to the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan in the late 1980s, and spent about $250 and came back with a surface-to-air missile. So it happens. And it happens with, obviously it happens with the smaller weapons and with the ammunition, grenades, handguns, rifles, submachine guns, heavy machine guns and so on. But it also happens with much heavier equipment. So there are second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand tanks and artillery pieces around the world in different places. So it's really, you're raising a really important issue, which, to be fair, I would imagine that those NATO country militaries, well indeed, and also including Sweden, which has been sending military aid, and others, are attempting to track. They will have marking systems on those weapons which will allow them to track them and to have a certain amount of control. But there is always a danger that in the chaos of war, the auditing processes can go wrong or be forgotten about, or weapons can just be left behind as forces move this way and that. Yeah, so you've raised a very important issue, and it does need to be looked after. In terms of peace building needing localization and community-based activity, although we've been talking primarily at the kind of the governmental and the international level, my perspective would be that actually most peace building happens at the local and the community level. It should be supported by, it should be facilitated by, and sometimes some parts of it need to be led by authorities, whether they're municipal or city or government or sometimes the international authority. But an awful lot of what is really required is about what people do, especially as the time after the peace agreement, if you like, after the peace, John Lennon he sang that you should give peace a chance, but I've always seen it the other way around, that peace gives a chance. If you get the agreement, you get the possibility to start doing really good things. And as you move further and further away from the time when the agreement was signed, you find that more and more, and you want it to be, that more and more, it is a real local ownership, not a kind of a paper local ownership, or the way in which sometimes in aid agencies they refer to a local ownership and they mean, local politicians. Really people, ordinary people, driving it forward. But you asked for some sort of making a difference moments. Well, in 2006, Andalan II, the Second People's Movement in Nepal, essentially changed the political system and created the conditions in which the Maoists could stop fighting, open up an office in Nepal, start being a political party, and things could move forward. In 1986, a popular movement, completely peaceful, in the Philippines, overthrew a 20-year military dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos. So, yes, you get civil society movements doing decisive things, but an awful lot of what they do is local and small, and it doesn't get the headlines, but it goes on, and it's absolutely fundamental.
I need to say thank you there and move on to Alberto Ferguson, please.
Thank you very much for asking this question about the community-based solutions, and thank you for asking for specific examples. One of the main findings of our Truth Commission is precisely that. There's a big chapter, about 2,000 pages, that's going to come out in June, showing more than 200 examples of very specific peace-building, community-based solution. We call it resistance, right, to war. People, communities that have resisted for 50 years, the leftist armed groups, the right-wing paramilitary, the drug traffickers, the state abuses of the military from the state, you name it, no? And so we are absolutely convinced that those are the only long-standing achievements in peace, is when a community, as someone mentioned, they become the owner of the peace. It's their peace. They protect it against whoever. Each time I see more and more, we see that government and the United Nations, they have a role, I would like to use the word, of accompanying these processes, and are very useful, but it has to be led by the community and by the people, and hopefully accompanied by international forces. So I think that's a very nice way to have the final message, and I think that we all agree on this. No, and it's, I would dare say it's kind of a conclusion of this beautiful and very interesting meeting.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you to the panelists who have fed us with their analysis, with their experience, with their personal reflections. It has been a great morning, very intense and limited in terms of time, but expansionary in terms of thoughts and ideas. So thank you so much to Mogens Lykketoft, to Ellen Margrethe Løj, to Dan Smith, and to Alberto Ferguson.